Hi everyone, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel, and welcome to the final installment in my read through of the Iliad. So I have an introduction video that I will link you to kind of explain what I'm doing with this, and I will also link you to part 1, part 2, and part 3 of this series so that you can get all caught up. And once you're ready, once you've seen all of those, then we will be ready to dive right into books 15 to 24 of the Iliad, which, in case I didn't mention, are the final books. You might have noticed, if you've been with this read along from the beginning, that this has taken a little bit longer than I thought that it was going to, but here we are. We've made it. This is the conclusion. So basically what happens in these 10 books of the Iliad is that the Greeks get pushed to their hardest point. It's the most dire moment for the Greek army, and Achilles finally sends out his friend Patroclus and the army from his part of Greece to go and fight the Trojans. But then Patroclus gets killed in this battle, and so Achilles finally breaks out of his determination not to fight, and he goes and fights the Trojans. And in the end, he kills Hector, who is Troy's greatest warrior, and that is basically where it ends. We'll talk about the ending, but yeah, that's basically what happens in the rest of the Iliad. So the first person I think we need to talk about a little bit more is Patroclus, this servant of Achilles who also grew up as his friend, and he's very much talked about as like this gentle, supportive guy who is kind of in this counselor role for Achilles. We also find out that Briseis, the girl that Achilles and Agamemnon were fighting over at the beginning, is also a really good friend of Patroclus, because when her first city got destroyed and her first husband got killed, which is like, yeah, this is how Achilles got her. That's fantastic. But anyway, when that happened, evidently Patroclus was kind of the person who first found her and was like, hey, we're going to help you. Don't worry. And so he has this reputation of being like a very nice guy. He's kind of like the softer side of Achilles. But then he actually gets out into the battle and he just turns into this total killing machine. Like, he's not even just trying to end the war as quickly as possible. He's not just trying to defend Achilles or anything. He like rounds up a bunch of Trojans on the beach, like between the beach and the wall that the Greeks have built, so that he can just hem them in and kill them off one by one. It's like, oh wow, that was kind of brutal. And now, in his defense, when he gets close to the walls of Troy, which is like really impressive that he drives the battle that far, it's like basically he drives it across the whole battle plane all the way to the walls of Troy, and then Apollo finds him and he's like, don't come up here, it will not go well for you if you do. So at least Patroclus is willing to listen to that. At least he has the humility and the wisdom to be like, this is not going to go well if I try to do this, so I'm going to back off. So he does that, but then it doesn't really help. And his death does feel very unfair, because it's one of those times where the gods just like intervene and force something to go a certain way, and it just feels very frustrating. It's like there's nothing that he could have done. It's not like he messed up and that's why he got killed in the battle. It was just, Zeus's overall plan to be like, I've got to give Achilles a chance to win a lot of glory before he dies. So that is like the only reason that Patroclus had to die, because that was the only way that Achilles was going to come fight and win glory and all of that stuff. So it is frustrating in that sense. And of course, when Achilles finds this out, he is extremely upset, and the unfairness of that situation does kind of help me understand that. And I'll dive more into Achilles in just a minute, but this might be a little bit of a controversial take for fans of the Iliad, and I know that those do exist. It might not seem like there are a lot of Iliad fans, but I know that you're out there, and this might be kind of controversial, but I really don't find Patroclus that sympathetic or likable. I mean, I guess he's okay, but I really don't find myself rooting for him all that much. So if you have a bunch of arguments to convince me why Patroclus is like the ideal best friend and buddy, then please let me know. But I really wasn't getting that from this. I still very much felt like I sympathized with and rooted for the Trojans a whole lot more. So then Achilles. I lost a little sympathy for him right at the beginning of this section, when he was insisting that his refusal to fight wasn't about the prophecy from his mom that he was going to die soon. He's like, no, I don't have some prophecy or anything. I'm just really mad at Agamemnon. So I was kind of like, if that's true and the prophecy is not affecting you as much as I thought, then that kind of takes away even the degree of excuse that I thought maybe he had. to be just sulking around. But I do think it's possible that he's just kind of in denial about the fact that the prophecy is bothering him as much as it is, or maybe he just still is not wanting to tell anybody else. So maybe he just doesn't want anybody else to know that that's bothering him as much as it is. On the positive side of Achilles, he does at least very much care about his dad and also Patroclus' dad and also Patroclus himself. Like, he does have other people that he cares about. He's not just completely worrying about himself. And I think it's interesting because of that he is as willing as he is to send Patroclus into the battle at all. Like, I kind of expected him to be like, no, you can't go out there. But at least he doesn't fall into that overprotective friend trope, and at least he's not pulling an Agamemnon with Menelaus and being like, no, you can't ever actually go into danger. Actually, I'm just going to keep you here in this little safe zone. But then we find out later that Achilles thought there was no way that Patroclus was going to get anywhere near the Trojan wall. Like, that didn't even cross his mind. And that's kind of why he was willing to send him out, because he just assumed that he wasn't going to get into fighting that was going to be all that dangerous. So maybe there is a little bit of Agamemnon in that, where he's sort of underestimating Patroclus because he sort of sees him as the weaker one in their pairing, so he just doesn't think Patroclus is going to do anything all that impressive, maybe, is kind of what it sounds like. And then it turns out that he's wrong, and like I said, Patroclus turns into a killing machine. Maybe I'm not the only one who found that surprising, because evidently Achilles wasn't really expecting that. So now there's this situation of tragic irony where Achilles basically has the situation that he wants, where the Greeks are desperate and they need him, and they're like, if you don't save us, we're doomed, and Agamemnon is going to kind of look like a loser at this point unless Achilles does something. So this is kind of what he wanted when he originally refused to fight. He was like, I'll show you, and well, he showed them, but it's not very satisfying because the cost is way too high. So at that point, Achilles actually starts fighting against the Trojans. And originally he was saying that he didn't really care about killing Trojans, but now he definitely does, because he has this sense that all Trojans are somehow guilty for the fact that Patroclus died, even though it was really the gods that killed him more than the humans. And he also has this sense that he really needs to have a single combat with Hector so that he can defeat him, and that will like officially avenge Patroclus. And he's kind of like, there's no way I'm going to get a single combat with Hector unless I fight through all of the Trojans between me and him. So that's, I think, part of why he's like mowing down all of these Trojans. But he is being unnecessarily brutal, and especially when people surrender to him, like, he's not giving them any mercy. And I just keep kind of being like, why is this going to help? Is this really going to make you feel better? I don't think so. The hardest one for me is that Hector's little brother, who's probably a teenager or younger, because he's too young to officially fight, but he sneaks out into the battle because he wants to fight for his city, and then Achilles just wipes him out, and he's like, Hector, that's what you get for killing my friend. And I'm like, but why is it okay for you to kill his brother? Like, yes, it's a battle, but it was also a battle when Patroclus got killed, and like, I don't really understand how Achilles is morally justifying all of this, but I don't know that he's really trying to morally justify it. I think in his mind, just revenge is what you have to do in order to honor your friend. I do think we get some kind of interesting insight into Achilles' motivation and justification for this when there's one Trojan who has surrendered to him and is asking to be spared, and Achilles is like, dude, I'm descended from the gods, and even I am about to die soon. Like, do you really think that you can avoid dying out here today? And so I think part of his reasoning is somehow like, well, I'm about to die too, so I might as well take as many Trojans with me as I can. So Hector and Achilles finally encounter each other and have this conversation, and Achilles has this line where he's like, we never could have been friends, and it 100% made me think of that scene in Avatar: The Last Airbender with Aang and Zuko. And if you're a fan of the show, you probably know what I'm talking about already, but there's a very similar line in there, and I was suddenly like, Achilles and Hector are kind of like Aang and Zuko. And I would definitely say that Achilles is the Zuko in this situation, where he's like this prince with daddy issues and a rough backstory who's now very moody and determined to kill a certain person in order to restore honor. And then Hector would kind of be the Aang in this situation, who is like just trying to defend his people and didn't really mean to cause any trouble, but he's having to sort of deal with other people's messes. And then I'm like, oh, if Achilles had been willing to listen to reason, like, he could have had this Zuko redemption arc. It would have been really cool, but that's not what happens in this story eventually. Not quite. But speaking of Achilles' character arc, his development at this point in the story where he kills Hector, sad, It's interesting how he has developed throughout the story, because he has made some kind of progress where he's coming to a sense of acceptance with what his fate is going to be, because he knows that killing Hector is basically setting off a chain of events that's going to lead directly to his own death on the battlefield of Troy. And at the beginning, he was trying to avoid his fate, he was complaining about it, he was definitely not accepting of it at that point. And then he's come to this point now where he's just like, I'm gonna die when I'm gonna die. And he's made a kind of peace with that, I guess. So, in a sense, he has sort of made progress from the anger that we saw from him at the beginning. And then also, I guess, what could be called the bargaining and depression that he was going through in the meantime. And then he's finally reached sort of this acceptance. So, I guess if the story is about rage, and at this point, his rage is sort of being satisfied, I guess, but he hasn't really grown morally. So it's not a normal character arc in that he really becomes a better person. He's sort of made progress as a person, but if anything, it's probably a negative character arc because he doesn't really start making better choices, at least not at this point. There is one more scene of his character arc that might change this a little bit, and I will kind of talk about that separately because it needs to come at the end. But I think it's interesting because it just doesn't feel like the kind of typical hero's journey character arc that you would see from a story written today. So then there's Hector, and if you guys remember from my last video, I talked about his fatal flaw, and if there's any doubt about that, then this section definitely confirms it. First off, he gets taunted a couple times about being a coward, which I'm just like, okay, that is demonstrably false. I'm not sure what you guys are talking about. But he lets that get under his skin, and again, he's having all of the success with the Greeks, and he's starting to feel pretty untouchable, and so he's getting kind of puffed up and prideful, and he feels like he doesn't need to listen to anybody's advice. And so this pride and overdependence then leads him to stay outside the walls of Troy when it's nighttime and everybody else is retreated because Achilles is wiping them out. And then because of that, he's more or less at Achilles' mercy, and he knows that Achilles is a better fighter than him. So it's interesting because the book calls this fate that kept Hector outside the city walls. So there's kind of an interesting combination of like, this was destined, this had to happen, but it's also like exactly probably what Hector would have done even if there hadn't been fate involved. His wife has this comment about him being characterized by dangerous courage, and it's like, yep, that is definitely what kept him outside the city walls in this case. It was pretty crazy. But it does fit with the other choices that he was making. So then it's interesting because he has this moment of recognizing like, oh shoot, Polydamas was right. If I had listened to him, I wouldn't be in this situation. So he does have the humility to recognize that he should have taken his advice, but then he's also like, if I go in the city now, I'm going to have to face up to Polydamas and admit that he was right. And so he doesn't want to do that. And then when he's finally willing to go into the city, it is too late because Achilles is already chasing him. And there's this kind of comical but also really gorgeously written at the same time section where Achilles is chasing Hector and they both run around the city like 3 times, which is crazy, and it's kind of funny. But Hector is trying to find a way to get in. He can't get in, and what's kind of crazy, one of the most relatable things in this entire book to me is that there's also a line where it's saying that this chase was like one of those dreams you have where you're running and running but you can never like get closer to what you're trying to get. I'm like, oh my goodness, people were having that dream 3,000 years ago. I mean, I've had a couple dreams like that, not as many as some people. I know some people have those dreams all the time, but if you were ever curious what humans dreamed about 3,000 years ago, like pretty much the same things that we dream about today. But anyway, he can't escape, so Hector has to choose between continuing to try to run away from Achilles or just turning around and facing his fate head on. So he does. He turns around and faces fate head on. So he's kind of similar to Achilles in that sense that at this particular part of the story, he makes that choice that like, no, I'm going to accept this. I'm going to face it with courage. I'm not going to try to run. I'm just going to do my best. And he goes down trying to defend Troy, which is what he has spent this entire book doing. And thus we lose the best character in the entire book. So speaking of that, one of the biggest themes throughout this section of the book, the Iliad in general, but especially these last few chapters, is mourning or lament. A lot of people die, and there's a lot of space given to the responses to the people who die. Even Zeus's own son, Sarpedon, dies, and then Zeus is sad about that, and he's kind of like, well, you know, it's too bad that I had to sacrifice him as part of this greater plan that I'm doing. And I'm kind of like, you had to, like there was nothing else you could do. But he's kind of sad about that. But I actually feel like Sarpedon's companion Glaukos has a more moving and impactful response, because he feels like he should have been able to protect his captain, but then he's also going to Hector like, you fought harder to get Patroclus' body so that we could have his armor and rob the Greeks of glory than you fought for Sarpedon's body, who's your own guy. So I felt like that kind of made sense, his frustration. And then Glaukos is just like, I'm done, I'm going home, like we're leaving, because he's just from a kingdom that like came and helped Troy. He's just one of Troy's allies, and he's like, we're done. And then of course there's Achilles mourning for Patroclus, which takes up a lot of space in the book, kind of a surprisingly large amount of space in a book that I think of as just being like very battle focused. There's actually a lot of this response to what happened in the battle, and Achilles' mourning is very loud and very public, and it's pretty long. And I find that interesting that it wasn't seen as at all shameful or weak for these big, strong warrior guys to spend a long time mourning their fallen comrades. That was just kind of part of it. Although Achilles is somewhat unusual, Odysseus does talk to him later about like, dude, we've all lost people in this war, but we mourn it, we deal with it, and we move on. But I do think there's a sense where in this culture it was a little bit more acceptable for people to be very out there with their emotions after someone they knew had died. And then also for Hector, actually, before the part where he dies, we hear from his dad Priam and his mom Hecabe, and they're basically saying that he's going to die and essentially lamenting his death before the fact. And it's honestly kind of hard to read because it's so painful. Like, there's nothing more universal than parent-child relationships, so there's just something understandable and relatable for anybody in those sections. But then they're also extremely specific with what exactly they are sad about, what they're going to miss. And I think really his mom is the saddest one, because everybody else in Troy sees Hector as this big strong warrior who's going to deliver them and everything, so they're mourning him in that way, but she's still seeing him as this little boy that she brought up. And then also at the end of that book, his wife laments after the fact, after he's been killed, and that is also really sad, especially because her main focus isn't on herself. She's not just feeling sorry for herself, she's thinking about her son and all that this is going to mean for their son in the future. And now I'm like really curious what happens to their son in the myths outside this book, because the book doesn't say what happens to him eventually. So I'm like, I hope that kid had a good life, but I kind of doubt it, because that doesn't usually happen in these Greek stories. So after Hector dies, and there's even more mourning for Patroclus, and it's all kind of eerie because Achilles is preparing Patroclus's funeral, but also with this thought that like, well, I'm gonna die soon, it's gonna be my turn soon, so it's almost like he's preparing his own funeral at the same time. So that's kind of weird. But then finally, like they have the funeral, they finish the cremation and everything, and it feels like at that point Achilles is finally ready to sort of start letting go of this thing. And then they have a bunch of games, like they go play a bunch of sports, which to me feels really odd. It's like that is a strange thing to do at a funeral, but that was evidently the normal thing for them to do. And as weird as it feels to me off the bat, I think it started to make some more sense. And they're really weird games too, because like everybody gets prizes. There are very much participation trophies in these games. Some of them are like wildly unfair, and sometimes they're just like, both of you win. And with the spear throwing competition, they're like, we all know that Agamemnon's the best, so we're just gonna give him first prize and not even have this competition. So like it feels very strange. But what also happens is that Achilles gets a chance to just hang out with his friends and do some fun things and be ridiculously generous with prizes for no reason, and laugh. Like there's one part where little Ajax is in the running competition. I think he falls down into a bunch of cow patties and gets a face full of cow patty, and like it feels so cartoony and goofy, but it makes Achilles laugh. And so here he is just laughing with his friends and thinking about other things besides the war and all that he's lost in the war. And it seems to really help his mood, which I can kind of understand. It's like, I think this is their way of transitioning from the mourning period back into normal life, and it kind of sort of actually makes sense. And in fact, it's after that that Achilles is finally ready, at Zeus's request and at his mom's request, to let go of Hector's body, which he's been holding. He wasn't letting anybody ransom it. He wanted to dishonor the body in revenge for Patroclus, and I think it was just as obvious to them then as it is to us now that that was not healthy for Achilles or anybody, and that he really needed to at least let Hector's parents bury the body and give him a reasonable, honorable send-off. So Achilles invites Hector's dad, Priam, out to the Greek camp, and so Priam is like really nervous that it's going to be a betrayal, it's going to be a trick, but he does eventually come out to the Greek camp. And so then there's this scene where like he comes into the tent, and like there's so much tension because you've got a Greek and a Trojan in the same room, not fighting each other. They both really want to kill each other. They're like pretty mad at each other still. It's not like all of the resentment has just gone away, but they sit down together and they have this talk, and they just like sit and cry together for a while, which after all that's happened in this book feels just so necessary and so fitting, that like these men from both sides just come together and cry it out, especially since Achilles is thinking, this guy reminds me of my dad, and my dad is going to be mourning for me really soon, just like this guy is mourning for his son. And Priam is thinking, this guy reminds me of my son that I just lost and that I'm mourning for. So they find this connection, and they're finally able to see each other as just people instead of seeing each other as enemies. And it's really a pretty powerful moment. And it's also very honest. Like it doesn't feel like this perfect wrap up, and it's clearly not supposed to. They even talk about like, well, I mean, none of this is gonna bring back the dead. Like it doesn't really solve the problem, and it doesn't end the war. It's not like they make a truce over this or anything. Achilles does agree to a ceasefire where he's like, okay, how long do you need for the burial? And Priam's like, give us 12 days. And so Achilles like, okay, I promise we're not going to attack for 12 days. And Priam's like, okay, we'll be ready by then. And then they both honor their agreement, which I appreciate that they at least honor the agreement. Unfortunately, they do go back to the battle after that, and the war lasts like several more years before there's any resolution. So it's not this clean wrap up. Like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the big moments of the Trojan War, like Achilles' death and the Trojan horse, they're not in this book. We don't get any of that big external resolution, but it did feel very internally complete to me because of just that scene of catharsis with the two of them, just recognizing how much they actually have in common and how much the war has cost both of them. And of course, I wish there could have been a little bit more resolution in terms of like an actual agreement to end the war or something, but sometimes that's not how it works in real life, and that's not how it works in this story either. But I did want to end by just talking about some of the cool, weird, fun, funny things that there are in this section, because there are definitely some interesting things that happen that I bet if you're not familiar with the story at all, I bet you did not see coming in a 3,000-year-old book from Greece. So one of the things is that Achilles gave Patroclus his armor to wear into the war, and then when Patroclus dies, the Trojans take that armor. So now Achilles doesn't have armor. So his mom goes to Hephaestus, the fire god, and is like, please make Achilles some new armor. And so Hephaestus makes him some armor, and like the descriptions are very epic. The shield that he makes him especially is ridiculous. Like there's a very long section describing the shield, and the shield basically shows like literally everything. It's like a portrayal of the whole universe, from the cosmic level all the way down to like, and there's a little sheep over here and there's a little sheep over here, and it's in motion. Like it's moving. There are people and animals actively moving and like going about their everyday lives in the picture on this shield, and it's just crazy. And what really makes it hit home is that I think what's happening is that Hephaestus knows that Achilles is going to die soon, and so he's essentially making this shield with the idea of he's a young man and he's not going to get to live out his life, so I'm going to give him as much life as I can just on this shield. So I think that's pretty crazy. That's pretty cool. But Hephaestus also has robots, which you might have heard about. That does get talked about some, that there are robots in this book. He has little metal tripods that move around on their own and do their own thing. And then he also has little metal girls who can like talk and do stuff on their own. And they could specifically be taught to talk and do stuff on their own. So I'm like, ancient Greek programming, anyone? Like that is kind of what this sounds like to me is essentially happening. And there's also this one really crazy scene where Achilles is fighting Aeneas, and he's just about to kill Aeneas, and there's all of this action, and then Achilles' sword is raised, and then it just stops. The action just stops, and then suddenly, I think it's Poseidon and Athena, they're talking, a couple of the gods just have this conversation, and there's even a footnote about like, scholars have disagreed about how this is possible for, this conversation to happen in this time period. And I'm like, I mean, I'm no scholar, but this doesn't seem confusing to me. This seems like slow-mo. Like the frame just stops and then we get this aside where the gods are just talking about it like outside of time. So that's kind of funny. And then so they decide that they need Aeneas to be alive. They can't let Achilles kill him right now. So they just pick him up and yeet him out of the battle, and he like lands behind the Trojan lines. So he flies over these guys in just like instantaneously and then lands on the ground and is not even slightly injured, which is hilarious. And it's so great. And then Achilles, just the next thing he knows, like Aeneas is gone. He's like, what happened to the guy that I was fighting? It's really funny. And again, it feels really cartoony, which is so not what I expected to be in this, but it is in there and it is kind of hysterical. And I just also think it's worth mentioning the river battle, which is pretty cool. If you've read this, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read this might be a little confusing, but basically there's a battle greatly involving a river. It's a sentient river, and it gets to talk to Achilles. It hunts down Achilles and tries to kill him, and then it gets into a battle with Hephaestus, who's the fire god. So there's the fire and the water, and it's just visually like really cool and a really interesting battle scene to read. So if you're interested in just unique battle scenes with lots of interesting like geography and set pieces, then I think you'll really enjoy reading that scene quite a bit, because it's actually very interesting, very action-packed, kind of funny at times, very tragic the whole time. The river gets a tough rap. I was rooting for the river, and the river did not win. Spoilers, but that was definitely an interesting part of the book that I didn't fully remember. I remembered a river battle, but it was cooler than I remembered. Okay, that is the Iliad. Thank you guys so much for sticking through this video. I know the videos in this series have been a little longer than normal. Thank you for sticking through this series if you've watched all of the videos. So let me know what you thought of that. Do you think that I should do more read-alongs? I am open to any feedback about that in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And until the next video, thanks for journeying with me. Bye!